Good. Okay. There's a sefer called Igros Seifrim, written by his son of the Ksav Sefer, and he brings a letter there from his grandfather Chasam Sefer that he wrote to one of his mechutanim when his daughter was engaged, and he writes that Vayos kasha alay ma'od laver al davar mefurish b'Torah. So it's very hard for me to be over on something that's mefurish b'Torah, not to marry off a younger child before an older one. And he says, he says, if you're willing to extend the engagement period for another 2 years, that hopefully within that time, my oldest son Reb Shimon will become a chassan, and I won't be over on this seemingly terrible issue of marrying off a younger child first. I wanted to discuss this inyan with the Makars. So there's a Tais and Kedushin Daf and Beis Amud Aleph. Tais says, Ma'isa bal lefnei Rabbeinu Tam. The Ma'isa came to Rabbeinu Tam's bezdin. The B'nai Shar B'Oishia HaLevi, one of the Rishonim, and the Ba'alei Tais B'Oishia, his son, Shekidesh Bas Asher Echad, V'Amar Bitcha Mekudesh Asli Stama. So this B'Oishia's son, he was Mekadesh, the daughter of a certain rich person, and he did not specify at the time of the Kedushin which daughter he was being Mekadesh. So Rabbeinu Tam said, among other things, Rabbeinu Tam says that so we should assume that he meant to be Mekadesh, the older one, because the pasuk in this week's parsha, that Lavan told Yaakov, the reason why I gave you Leah instead of Rachel was because Leah said, if you don't do such a thing, to give the younger daughter before the older one. So therefore, says Rabbeinu Tam, we could assume that he meant to be Mekadesh, the older one. And Taisus brings Rabbi Nachum Yoni Nechlak Olav, and other Rishonim at that time were strongly arguing Rabbeinu Tam, and they said that we cannot assume that he meant to be Mekadesh, the older one. And Taisus brings at the end, Rabbeinu Tam Chazer Bar V'Le'avad Uvda, Rabbeinu Tam himself retracted his psak and did not pass him like that lamaisa. However, it does seem from Taisus that there is in fact an Indian to make sure to marry off the older child first. Just we can't necessarily assume that was what his das was, but there is such a concept. And the tour in Simreish Mandal in Yerdea says, "Ubemesiba shal mishte oishal nesuin, holchem achar hazikna leshiva bereish." Halacha is, but mesiba shal mishte. He's talking about the halachas of being machabed in different leifanim. Sometimes we go after Chachma, who's a bigger Chachma than the other. Sometimes we go after Zikna, who's older. And the Torah's passing with Mesiba Shal Mishta, Shal Nesuin, we go after Zikna, and the Bach is very niskasha. What's the Chiddush? Why do we think this would be different? And the Bach wants to be Mechadish that what the Torah means to say is this halacha. If you have two brothers or two sisters and they're making a nesuin, afagav she'echad gadol mechaver b'chachma, like dinu la'aseis nesuin lakatan b'shanim, should not allow the one who's a bigger chacham to go before the one who's older. You have to marry off the older one first. And he says because of this halacha of lo yasa came in la'aseh sasir l'fnei achira. And the Shach over there in Reish Mem Daled brings this halacha. Near the high Nisul Nesuin Achad Birushaim Achme Achayis Yaslam Nesuin, he quotes the Bach that the older one should be the first one to get married before the younger one.
Why is it so passionate that Rasa came in with that means we can't do it? We're not lived there was them came in.
So you're asking the Wichtesi, how can you learn that from that pasuk? Yeah. What's the right? So B'chal, it's interesting. We're learning out, like you're asking, we're learning out from Lavan. Lavan was a Ramai. One of his uses as a trickery to trick Yaakov into giving him the wrong daughter that they made up upon. So Chaim Kanievsky in Time of the Torah, he actually says, he asks this Zakash, and he says that you look in the Midrash and that Lavan made thousands of tricks. The Torah doesn't tell us all those. Why does the Torah tell us this one? It must be the Torah's Gufa coming to tell us that there is tak a proper halacha to be makbid on.
Wasn't
Oh, we'll get to that. And the Jews, there's other halachas, a lot of, I think there's 5 halachas. I heard someone say that we learn out of Lavan and Sheva brachas and other halachas. We do learn from those psukim over there. Yeah. But the Jews, we find this in another place in the Torah as well. Rashi in the end of Parshas Masay brings down a Gemara of Basra. Daf Kuf Chaf Amar Aleph. The Gemara asks that there seems to be a steer of the psukim between the Parsha of Bnei Tzlavchad when the Torah says the names over in the Parsha of Nachla. It says it over in one way. And later on in Parshas Masay, when it says they got married, it lists them in a different order. The Gemara says, La'alon monan akasav derech gidulasan, b'kan derech achmasan. Later on in Parshas Masay, it's listing them in the order of gidulasan, is order of age. And in the Parsha of Nachla, it's going derech chachmasan in the order of chachma. Simply that's when they came to present the shayla. They had this chachma, like the Gemara says, that was the order of how much chachamas they were. So Rashbam over there says, "La'alon k'shenisu b'nei tzlavcha when they got married, monan akasav derech gidulasan." It lists them in order of age. D'chsiv atiyana machla tirtza chaglo u'milko b'nei tzlavcha l'bnei dedeim l'nashim. It says the Rashbam u'mistaber dekach noldu. It's probable to say that this was the age, that this was the order of age. Why? D'chsiv lo yasen kein mim kemenu l'asas atzeir l'fnei bechira. He brings this pasuk that the Lavan said, we don't do such a thing to give the younger one first. So therefore it's mitzvah to say that the pasuk is listing them when they got married in age order. So this seems to be another makar for this Indian of dafka being makar on age order in terms of getting married. So the shaila is what's the reason behind this? Why would there be such a halacha? So there are those who want to suggest that the yesod of this din is the halacha of being mechaber achicha hagadol. Gemara in Ksubas Daf Kaf Gimel, I think, that the vav of the s imech has to be marbe achicha hagadol. You have to be mechaber him. Now, to say that that's the makar of this halacha, you would have to hold that there's a chi of achicha hagadol doesn't only apply to an older brother but an older sister as well. They were sisters. So that's a whole inyan in itself. The Shvus Yaakov in Shuvas in Chelagav Siman Ayin Vav, he brings that the Ramban in Sefer HaMitzvahs, he says that the kavod the gdulas avi the imo yerish b'nam hagadol, that the oldest son is the one who's yerish it's like the legacy and the kavod, the godless of his parents. He takes over their crown, and therefore that's why there's any to be mechaber achicha. That's this mitzvah of kibbur achicha hagadol, and he says that definitely does not apply. There's definitely no inyan to be mechaber an older sister. Not only even within brothers, only be the oldest brother, not any older brother would not have this halacha of kavod. So according to Shvus Yaakov, definitely cannot apply this halacha to this inyan of getting married age order. However, the Birkei Yosef and Yerdis and Rish Mem, he brings the Shvus Yaakov, and he's very ma'arich to argue on the Shvus Yaakov, and he says that the Ramban's svara definitely applies as well to a sister, and the parents definitely are mechuber and they're interested that their younger children should be mechaber their older siblings, and therefore it says Birkei Yosef, there is a chiyuv to be mechaber an older sibling, whether it's a brother or sister, not dafka the oldest one. So according to the Birkei Yosef, we could say maybe that's the halacha, that's the makar of this din to marry in age order would be because of this chiyuv kibbur. So I saw that someone wanted to make a cheshbon that it doesn't stem the Birkei Yosef, because the Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah Lamed Gimel, he's medayik there's machlekes the Rambam with the Ramban if the chiyuv of being mechaber achicha hagadol applies after the death of the father. And he explains the basis of the machlekes would be whether you understand that the chiyuv of kibbur achicha hagadol is a bazunder chiyuv, is it a new chiyuv specifically towards the brother, its own mitzvah to be mechaber achicha hagadol, which in that case would apply even lachar misa, even after the father dies, or if you hold that it's a sniff of the mitzvah of kibbur av v'eim, it's just a chelek of kibbur av, is that the father is interested in the younger children being mechaber their older brother, and therefore it goes into the chiyuv of kibbur av, which in that case, Mechizah says, it would not apply after the father dies. So, kipshuta, you could understand that the machlekes, the Shvus Yaakov and the Birkei Yosef, if there's a chiyuv to be mechaber Achoisei Hagdela would be the same understanding, the same machlekes. If the chiyuv is a new chiyuv toward the chicha hagadol, so like the Gemara says, "Mar be'achicha hagadol," it's only chicha hagadol. But if you say like the Birkei Yosef that it's really a chelik the mitzvah kibbud av, again, so the Shus Yaakov, it would come out that there was no difference whether the father died or even after the father dies, it still is the skip the chicha hagadol. It's not bound to the father b'chlal. Shengel the Birkei Yosef, the chayr would come out. It should be that the chiyuv is only a sniff of kibbud av, and after the father's not there anymore, so there's no covet to be mechaber the older sibling. He wouldn't have to do that. And if that's true, though, that the Birkei Yosef would hold there's no chiyuv to be mechaber the chicha hagadol achar misas aviv, would not be able to say that this is the pshat in the din of getting married in age order, because by B'nai Tzavchad, where we do apply this halacha, the whole parsha Nachla is talking about that the father wasn't alive anymore. So you wouldn't have this chiyuv of kibbud achos yagadayla, and therefore even if the Birkei Yosef the chayr should come out, you wouldn't be able to say this. But the Ma'aseh, if you look in the Birkei Yosef, he's in the first. He says straight out that a person is mechaber to be mechaber his older brother, his older sister, and he says bain if the father's alive, and bain after the father dies. So the Birkei Yosef could come out that this could be a makar of this halacha. Could be the basis of this halacha of getting married would be this chiv kibbud.
Parent has to make sure the children have each other. The parent wants to marry him off.
So for what?
I'm saying the parent is marrying a child. The child being pregnant.
Whose chiv is it? Right.
So if it's the chiv to the brother, you mean?
Brother,
No, it's not going to. It won't work for Yishak Mechala. Was the Fida Birkei says it was really a chiv based on the Timim Mechaber the father.
I'm saying the parents want to marry off the younger daughter.
He's saying they would saying you want to know if the father doesn't care. Okay, maybe if he's Michael. Yeah, a lot of times the father's the one he wants to marry the older one first, and it's the younger son who wants to get married. But I was thinking maybe because a little different mahalach to explain this, and that's that the Shus Yaakov over there in the Tshuva, he brings a very interesting medrash in this week's parasha actually, not connected to the other pasuk. He says, the medrash says, "Vatan rachav alei v'teimar naloi." Towards the end of the parasha, I think it was Yaakov was telling over the nevuah he got to go back to his father, and Rachel Alei says Rachel Alei answered v'teimar naloi. The medrash says, "Lama meisa Rachel tchila." Why was Rachel? Why did she end up dying first? Because she spoke before her sister who was older than her. So this could have sounded like that. Rachel shouldn't have spoken in front of her older sister. But he says, so this is not a right b'chalal. So this is not an Indian of being mechaber. Rakshu bizui. He says to speak in front of someone who's bigger than you, older than you, it's not the pshat that you're not being mechaber them. It's being mevaza them. It's a biza. So maybe the same thing could apply over here, that even if you hold there's no chiv to be mechaber an older sister, but even to be the Shus Yaakov, maybe to get in order for a younger sibling to get married before the older one would be like an Indian of biza, which sounds like that's pasha, that you would not be able to be mevaza like that. Maybe that would be the makar. The Igris Moshe is very unhappy with this whole notion that there's a halacha, there's an isser for the younger sibling to get married first, and he has to allow the older one to get married first. There's a shaila here, the ach tzair, yachal lisa isha kodim achav agadol, kisha achav makbid. So there's two brothers that the older brother did not want the younger brother to get married first, and there was a shidduch suggested for the younger brother, and the Chotin wanted that the chazan should happen right away, and didn't want to wait for the older brother to get married. So Moshe says, "B'nei pashul ani has died to after chatchila yochel achtzar lisa isha after achal agol alinas damle adayin isha." He says it's pashut lachatchila. The younger brother would be allowed to get married before the older one. Does not have to wait for the older one to get married. He's like talking to say that the young one has a chiv to get married. He has no reason why he has to push off his chiyuv for Ruvu. He's a mitzvah to get married. Mechadei to push it off, just because he's younger but didn't find the shirchiyah. And Moshe says, "U'mashra isi esim achabrim." This that the Svarim bring, there's a raya from the Shach and the Taz, the Shach and the Bach we quoted earlier, that seem to say there is such a halacha. So The Mishnah says tois gomer. It's an absolute mistake. Shashach b'shem abach ayri b'sha'oimdim shnei achim lasis nesuim. So the Mishnah Machadish that the Shach is talking about shekvan eshtadchu shneim. I'm talking about there's two brothers. They're both engaged already. They're both going to get married. So you have a shiloh. Which one should I do first? So there, Dr. Moshe, the Shach says that there's an Indian to be mechabed to give the older one first. The first one comes first. We let him get married first. But that's dafka because they're both oimid to get married. They're both ready to get married. She should go first. But in a case where it wasn't, where only the younger one is engaged, only the younger one found the shidduch now. The older one didn't find it yet. So there's no Indian b'chalal Dr. Moshe who have to wait for the older one to find the shidduch.
And girls don't have approval.
And you wouldn't have that nakud over there. So he doesn't say that. He's just klapi the shayla. He's answering like that. But he says b'chalal. He says b'nei tzlavchad. Even girls are saying. But b'nei tzlavchad. He said it must be nizdamnu l'kul l'mishi nasib b'zanachad. It must be that they all found someone to marry at the same kufa, and therefore mistam they got married in aged order. So the Mechas Yitzchak brings this information to Shuv, and he says that it's very shver to say that b'nei tzlavchad the pshat is that they must have found the sheikh at the same time. He says the Gemara is trying to be mechiach that it was derech gedulasa. Right? It must be that the pasuk has been saying them in age order when they got married. Why? Zakt Rashbam, because that's how you have to do it. You have to first get married, the older one, then the younger one. But if you tell me that it's only in the case where they're nishtadchu, so in which case they were nishtadchu, maybe they weren't nishtadchu, and then you have no right that the pasuk is going like that. Oh, so then he asked another kasha he asked. And Logan says also there was no shidduch between Yaakov and Leah to have to give Leah first. Leah was stam. She was going for Esav even. So how could you say that the whole din is only over there? But the Maisa he says, like that, the Ramesha does have a rayim b'churachas. There's halacha. The Ramesha says that the Gemara, the Mishnah of Samachdal and Beis Kedushin says a makadesh as bita stam in a burgers b'chalal. The Gemara is talking about you have two daughters, one older one, one younger one. The Gemara says makadesh is bita. He didn't specify which one. The assumption is talking about the older one, by the younger one, because that's the one that's Rami Alei, and even though the older one had made him a shliach, we assume that the kedushin is for the younger one. Rashi says if there would be any sort of isser, any din that you have to makadosh marry off the older one first before the younger one, there would be no way to say that the assumption is he's talking about the younger one. So Lamais, it seems that there are G'dolei Achronim and Poskim that did go with such an Isser and such an Indian to be makbid on first marrying of older children, and if a person could have that the older children are Meichel Lahedya, be definitely better. But it seems that Moshe Paskin that there's not no Indian and no chiyuv for a person to wait for an older sibling. Just to add on what the Rafim was asking before, that even if you could answer why there isn't an Indian, but Yaakov Avinu, what was his pshat? Right? So what was Yaakov thinking? So Archaim asks his kasha. I saw the Marsham in Sefer Tchilas Mordechai says that Rashi brings in last week's parasha that Rashi says that Yaakov was bedin oiches b'akev Esav. He was holding on to the b'cher bedin. Why? Because Tzer Lamad from a shvei first, you have a narrow tube. Rashi says whichever stone goes in first, that's going to come out last. So Yaakov Avinu was really mitipa rishayna, and he went into the tube first, and therefore he came out last. But he held it. Technically, he was really the b'char. He was the first one that was created. So he says that Rabbeinu Ephraim says that Rachel and Leah were also really twins, and therefore Yaakov held that l'shitasai Rachel was really the b'chayra because she was the one who went in first, the Tipi Rishayna, and therefore he assumed that he would be allowed to marry her against that. And just to end off with a little anecdote that when it started, people started asking for pictures for shidduchim. So someone came to the Belzer Rebbe and he told him about this new fad. People were asking for shidduchim. So he said, we don't put a tziru, we put the picture before the bechira.